Welcome to At Home with Music. I'm Leon Olguin. In a previous video, I showed you sus chords. So for example, if we're in the key of C, and you start with a basic C major triad, you have the C sus 4. There's a fourth between the C and the F. That's the note that we added when we suspended this E. We raised it half a step, it became these three notes, and it just needs to resolve back to the tonic. And then we looked at the sus 2 chord, where you have a second between the root and the note that is the suspended note that resolves back to the third. They work in major and minor. Interestingly, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the last video, but the sus 4 chord is more popular than sus 2 because it has a stronger pull to the tonic. But this one works just as well. Now what I want to show you in this video is how you can slip the sus chords into common chord progressions. So we'll look at some of the most famous chord progressions, and I'll show you how you can add suspended chords into those progressions to make them sound even more interesting. Then I'll demonstrate how you can slip those sus chords into songs. And I'm going to use as my example some songs that I've used before, very famous songs, very simple songs. Everybody knows these tunes. And I'll show you how you can slip those sus chords in there to make them sound more interesting. And then finally, I'll show you a few examples of sus chords used in popular songs. And by the time we get through with this, when you start listening to popular music, you might start hearing those sus chords popping up, because they are definitely part of the chord vocabulary. So let's switch to the overhead camera, and then you can see how I can play these sus chords and add them to songs, add them to progressions, and so on. Okay, we can start with the 2-5-1 progression, which in the key of C, you remember, is D minor, G, C. Now we can make this even more interesting by adding sus chords. So D minor can become D sus, which resolves to D minor, G sus, which resolves to G, and C sus, which resolves, I keep wanting to say revolves, which resolves to C. We can also do this with sus 2 chords. So you remember, if we just write something like D sus, it is assumed that that is a sus 4, so you don't have to put the 4. But if we do a sus 2 chord, you want to put that 2 in there to differentiate it from the sus 4. So if we use sus 2 chords, it has a little bit of a different flavor to it. Another famous progression that we've studied is the 1-5-6-4. And we can begin by putting sus chords at the beginning. C sus resolving to C, G sus resolving to G, A sus resolving to A minor, and then here, instead of using F sus, we're going to use F sus 2. And so it sounds like this. If we were to use F sus the other way, it would sound like that. That could be good too, depending on what you like. And we can play this in different voicings. So that's how you can slip the sus chords into these famous chord progressions. But let's see how we can do it using some familiar tunes. I'm going to use as my example here, Mary Had a Little Lamb, which I've used in several videos now. But I like to use this because it's very simple, very memorable. Everybody knows this tune. Now, we originally played it just using two chords, C and G. Now we can make this more interesting by adding sus chords in some places that you might not normally think to put them. Watch what we can do here. That is G7 sus, only the notes have been rearranged. If we play it in root position, all with one hand, that's what it would sound like, and it resolves to G7. But we've taken the notes here and we've moved them down. Same four notes, they're just arranged differently now. They're voiced differently. And it just so happens that C is the tune. And it can resolve from G7 sus, I should say, to G7 and then back to C. And we can do the same thing here. And then here, we can just use a straight G sus to G, G7 sus, G7, and then here, we can do something fancy with A sus 2 we can use, or just A sus. And then here, we can use that G7 sus chord, and we have E in the melody. So we get this very interesting, slightly dissonant chord that wants to resolve to G7. So underneath we have the melody, and then you can be fancy and end with a C sus. So it sounds like this. Another song I like to use as an example is Amazing Grace. You remember we've played it very simply, just using 1, 4, and 5, or G, C, and D. Now let's add some sus chords in there to make it even more interesting. You can even start with 1 just to be fancy. And here, you can use C sus 2, which quickly resolves to C, and then G sus 2 here. Now here, you can actually use, this is A7 sus with a B in the melody, which quickly resolves to A7. And then you can put D sus here. You'll notice anytime you have a song like this that ends on a 5, when the phrase ends on a 5 and there's a big pause and you're getting ready to go into the next phrase, you can throw a sus chord in there. And then G sus here. Here add C sus 2. Here you have your choice. You can do G sus or G sus 2. Either one works. Whatever sounds good. Now here, there's our D7 sus with B in the melody, which resolves to D7, and then you can do something really fancy here at the end. G sus, G sus 2, G sus, G. So it sounds like this. Another famous hymn you can use to add sus chords to is What a Friend We Have in Jesus, in the key of F. And here's one of those examples where you have a phrase that ends on the 5. You can throw a sus chord in there. Now here's a few examples of popular songs that use sus chords. For example, if any of you know the old song, Cold as Ice by Foreigner, it starts out with this. E sus, E minor, E sus, E minor. And I can't sing it, but that's how it starts. Anyway, it's full of sus chords. And then there's a famous song by Tom Petty. This is one of my favorites by him. And it starts out. She's a good girl, and so on. I love the lyrics in that first verse. They cracked me up. Anyway, you can go find this on YouTube to hear the whole thing, but it is chock full of sus chords. Then there's the famous song by The Who. And there is no way I can sing this, and it's very difficult to play this as a solo tune. But as you go through the verse, you find it goes from B sus to B, and then it goes to A sus to A, and then G sus to G, and then the deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball. Sounds better played on guitar by Pete Townsend, by the way. As you listen to popular music, you'll begin to hear the sus chord used, and it can be a very effective tool to make the chord progressions more interesting. I hope you found this helpful. Have some fun with these sus chords. See if you can spot them in the songs that you're listening to. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.